In 1963, Ford made a commitment to racing in general, and a commitment to winning at Le Mans in particular. Designer Roy Lund took the U.S. Ford team to England, where, under the knowledgeable eye of Britisher Eric Broadley, the GT-40 was developed and refined. Ford hired John Wyer as team manager, and in 1964 the prototypes ran 8 events, not finishing any, but engraving the name Ford on the minds of other competitors. The early pointed snout was not to remain, but the peaked rear body section was retained as the Mark I version appeared on the racing scene in 1965. The Mark I was, to all who witnessed it, a legitimate race car, still having some teething problems, but showing impressively in every outing. For 1965, Eric Broadley had left Ford, returning to his Lola efforts in England, and Shelby American was chosen to develop the GT-40's potential. Their first change was to remove the Indy engine from the car and replace it with the more reliable 289 Cobra power plant. The pointed snout of the early cars was replaced with a blunter nose, which improved the aerodynamic qualities considerably. The quartz headlights and large radiator opening dominated the front of the racer. The Mark I's design gave the car a much higher top speed and also reduced rear-end lift that plagued earlier prototypes. The Mark I had dual fuel filling spouts, one on either side of the car, but for Le Mans only one filler was permitted, the other having to be closed off. The aerodynamics of the rear section was essentially unchanged from the earlier prototypes. The rear air ducts now only had to supply air to the rear brakes and oil radiators, whereas in earlier versions, the water radiator was also located sternward. A small lip fabricated into the rear body section was the only aerodynamic addition required for high-speed stability. With its aerodynamic problems under control, and with the reliability of the Cobra 289 proven, the GT-40 won its first race at the Daytona 2,000 kilometers in January 1965. And Ford left for Le Mans with high and confident spirits. The GT-40 was a showcase for Ford's highly advanced engineering skills. Here, plainly illustrated, is Ford's solution to the problem of easy driver entry and exit. More than one GT-40 driver commented on the comfort and engineering excellence of the car while in competition. The dash was fully molded from plastic and included flow-through air ducts for ventilation, and very complete instrumentation with all dials pointing directly toward the driver. There was easy access to all switches. A 200-mile-per-hour speedometer dominated the left side of the instrument panel. Special attention was paid to the layout of each component so as to allow the driver to put all of his concentration efforts on driving the car. The pedal assembly was typical of Ford's talent. An adjustable cluster mounted on an aluminum casting with dual piston brake cylinders and balance beam and hydraulic clutch cylinder. The GT-40's seats resembled those aboard sophisticated aircraft of the day. The seat pad was suspended by nylon straps, and air was allowed to flow under the seat and through perforations in the seat itself. Driver comfort was a high priority with the Ford team. Number 1028 was a car originally owned by Ford's Public Relations Department. It was air-conditioned and driven on the street. Electric cooling fans were not normally installed in competition versions of the car. The present owner restored the car in the Gulf colors. A Boss 302 engine provides the push in this example, and the strong power plant is coupled with a ZF 5-speed transmission. The monocoque chassis was stressed 22-gauge steel box assembly. Shelby replaced the original wire-spoked wheels with solid alloy versions. An unstressed glass fiber body was mounted on the chassis. The engine compartment of the GT-40 provided very good access to all aspects of the business end of this automobile. The early cars used a Colati non-synchromesh transmission, which proved very troublesome. After much modification and frustration, Shelby engineers were elated by the availability of the new ZF transmission. Gas tanks were fabricated into the monocoque chassis and were slung on either side of the racer. Rubber bladders within the tanks held a total of 42 gallons of fuel. Large rubber donuts were integrated into the half shafts to reduce vibrations between the transaxle and outboard wheel assembly. The ZF transmission proved to be much more reliable than the Colati, but was only a stopgap measure until Ford had developed a transmission of their own. The Mark I proved to be unprepared for the 1965 Le Mans Challenge, as Ferrari dominated the victory stand. While all this was happening, however, Ford began to prepare for the 1966 season, with extensive testing of what was to be known as the Mark II. Mark IIs ran in prototype form in 1965 alongside of their predecessors, the Mark I. The late Ken Miles was the top developmental driver for Shelby's testing of the Mark II. The Mark II utilized basically the Mark I body with minor modifications to the rear bulkhead and frame in order to incorporate a new large 427 cubic inch motor which weighed 250 pounds more than the 289. This Mark II is being tested at Willow Springs Raceway by driver Ken Miles in early 1965 prior to its debut at Le Mans. Newly designed air ducts under the front of the car helped cool the front brakes. Ford saw little or no success with either the Mark I or Mark II in 1965, as the drivetrain was not reliable for long-distance racing. As a result, following the 1965 Le Mans race,
An ambitious development program was initiated to ensure success for the 1966 race schedule. A totally new Ford-designed transmission was built to mate with the 427 engine. Ford's Aeroneutronics division became involved. Wind tunnel testing found that the internal ducting of the car was absorbing over 75 horsepower just to cool the driver, oil, water, and brakes. Redesigning the outer bodywork and air ducts reduced that to less than 30 horsepower. The drivetrain was the key to success in long-distance racing, so Ford engineered a simulator in the form of a dynamometer that would put a drivetrain through the same type of torturous routine that would be encountered in a 24-hour race. To provide a safe margin, the test ran for 48 hours. These tests were run again and again and again until every failed part was redesigned and replaced with one that would survive 48 hours of shifting, braking, acceleration, and deceleration. The large rubber donuts used on the early half shafts were replaced with Dana couplings. Stock carburation on this particular example has been replaced by a multiple Weber system. The electrical system of the GT-40 was engineered in the same thorough manner as the rest of the car. All gauges used were the best and most reliable that money could buy. The switches and controls were those used in heavy-duty truck and aircraft applications. The wiring was a high service temperature type to ensure proper insulation under severe conditions. A 53 ampere battery was especially prepared to survive under heavy vibration loads. Number 1012, seen here in recent action, was a result of all that testing and went on to become a famous finisher in the 1966 Le Mans event. All the testing and development work started paying off at the beginning of the 1966 season. Successes at Daytona and Sebring had the Ford people at their Carcraft facility in Dearborn highly motivated in anticipation of success at Le Mans in June. The engineers had proven the drivetrains could last 48 hours. The motors were all giving 485 horsepower on the dyno. In their final form for the big race, the GT-40s were known as Mark IIAs. Twin periscope-like air ducts rose up from the rear deck, a late addition to lower rear brake temperatures and keep the brake fluid from boiling. Although not present on number 1012 at this time, these ducts were an important addition in keeping the 2,600-pound cars under control. The weekend following Sebring was practice for Le Mans. 5 cars were sent to this practice session, 2 Mark IIAs, 2 GT-40 Mark Is, and the newly completed J car prototype. This latter car, due to its large rear end, was immediately dubbed the bread wagon. The J car, designed and built at Carcraft from a clay model in December of 1965 to a running car in February of 1966, was the first Ford sports prototype racing car to be totally designed and built in America. On Sunday's practice laps, the J car turned better lap times than the Mark IIAs. The disconcerting thing to the Ford people was the total absence of Ferraris at the practice session. For the race at Monza, Ferrari's backyard and test circuit, Ferrari only turned out one 330 P3. Ford did not enter this race, but there were 6 privately entered GT-40s. In a race run in steady rain, Ferrari easily took first place, but 3 early GT-40 Mark IIs came in 2nd, 3rd, and 6th. Score for Monza: Ferrari 10 points, Ford 11 points. The Sicilian Targa Florio, a twisting road race through several towns, saw Ferrari entering one 330 P3 and 3 Dinos, with privately entered cars accounting for 6 more entries. A privately entered GT-40 Mark I held 4th place until the last lap, when it lost a wheel and crashed. Results of this race: Porsche 1st, 3rd, and 5th, Ferrari 2nd and 9th. Score: Porsche 18, Ferrari 7, Ford 0. The race at Spa in France, May 22nd, the following weekend, found Ferrari entering one 330 P3 and Alan Mann entering one of the GT-40 Mark IIAs from Daytona. The 330 P3 took first for Ferrari, the Mark IIA second, while privately entered GT-40 Mark Is gave Ford points for 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Score: Ferrari 9, Ford 15, Porsche 2. The lack of Ford factory representation at Monza and the Targa Florio was deliberate. The time was used for final development tests at Kingman, Arizona and Riverside International Raceway. At Kingman, it was found that full out, the GT-40 Mark IIA was a wee bit faster than the J car. During the 1st of May, Miles and Mark Donohue with Marvin Panch and Dick Hutcherson put both cars through a 24-hour run over 3 days at Riverside. The J car didn't make it through the first day, but the Mark IIA came through with flying colors. Ford brought a total of 8 cars to Le Mans. Both Shelby American and Holman and Moody prepared a set of cars. Ferrari was heavily favored to win the race as their P3s were very strong. The start was clean and everyone got away. Everyone except Ken Miles. Buckman in the 5 car is quickly off. Miles' trouble started when his door would not latch properly. He was then hit in the side by Whitmore in the number 8 car. Hawkins, in snap clutching his Mark II at the start, went the first hour in the pits getting a half shaft replaced. Miles held his door shut for the first lap, and then he spent 2 laps in the pits getting that fixed. By 5 p.m., Miles was breaking lap records and team strategy as well, and was catching up with the leaders. Miles then proceeded to get into a race with Gurney in another Mark IIA and continued to lower track records. The first hour passed without seeing the Fords in the pits for gas. This confused the Ferrari team as they were expecting a big advantage in fuel consumption. Apparently, Ford's development program on the 427 engine also helped lengthen the period between fuel stops. At 6 p.m., the Fords remained in front of the Ferraris. Donohue's Mark II loses his rear deck on the Mulsanne straight at 200 miles per hour. He stops, retrieves it, wires it on, and manages to get back to the pits for repair. 2 laps later, he is back in the pits for good with transmission failure. As evening approaches, the Porsche 906 Longtails continue in train fashion, although several laps down. A couple of nasty-looking accidents occur, but no one is seriously injured. Miles and Gurney continue to race in the lead, and at 10 p.m. are in the pits for new pads. At 11:30 p.m., the Chaparral with hill driving is in the pits with a dead battery and cannot restart. Miles is having fun in the nighttime rain, setting a blistering pace. Graham Hill in the number 7 car walks into the pits, having abandoned his Mark II. The accident was caused by a warped brake disc. This problem was known to the Ford teams, and as a result, all the cars were brought in during the night to have their brake disc changed. A quick change design prevented little loss of time to perform this work. One of the many Le Mans regulations required that the spare tire had to be removed and touched to the ground any time a tire was changed. We see the Gurney Grant crew perform this little ritual to keep the technical inspectors happy. At 10:30 a.m., Gurney and Grant in the number 3 car are out of the race with a leaky radiator that cooked the engine. Miles and Holm continue to lead with the number 1 car. At fuel stops, an inspector was required to seal both the oil and fuel tank lids every single stop. This prevented a driver from taking on fluids at any other point on the track without the inspectors being aware of it. As the race winds down, the Fords keep cranking along. The 906 Porsches continue running in a tight group, but are now 14 laps behind Miles and Holm in the #1 Ford. Ken Miles discussing race strategy with Carroll Shelby. Eventual winner Bruce McLaren, who teamed with Chris Amon. At 2 p.m., it became obvious that the Fords were going to finish 1, 2, 3. Miles, McLaren, and Bucknam were instructed at their last pit stop to finish 3 abreast. As the last lap approached, Miles and McLaren slowed to allow Bucknam to catch up. At 4 p.m., they rolled around together with McLaren slightly ahead of the obvious winner, Miles. Miles was announced as the winner, but 2 minutes later, another announcement was made declaring McLaren the winner. As it happens, they were on the same lap, and the rules say that in a tie, the car that started farthest back on the starting grid shall be the winner, because he traveled the greatest distance in the race. To say the least, Miles was not too happy, and McLaren was more than a little embarrassed. Nevertheless, Ford pulled off an impressive victory, breaking the Ferrari victory at Le Mans and beating them badly. Amazingly, Ford also won the Index of Thermal Efficiency prize with an amazing mileage of 5.8 miles per gallon. Ford also won the World Manufacturers' Championship in 1966 with 90 championship points compared to Ferrari's 38. Ford built 4 open cockpit roadster versions of the GT-40. The basic chassis was a Mark II, and it was raced in the sports prototype classification. One of these cars won the Sebring 12-hour race in March of 1966. The slightly lighter chassis did not show any particular performance advantage over the closed versions, so the development of the Roadster was not pursued. This particular car, number 109, is undergoing total restoration. A 255 cubic inch 4-cam Ford motor is being installed, as is a ZF transaxle. The open cockpit models are the rarest of all the GT-40 variations. It takes many, many parts to fabricate a complete car. cast aluminum pedal assembly, fully adjustable coil-over shock absorbers, a completely polished transaxle case. The J-car prototype, run during the 1966 season, evolved into the Mark IV and was built to FIA Group 6 Appendix J specifications, hence the J designation. It was totally conceived and constructed in Detroit, late in 1965. The basis for this chassis was to be an aluminum honeycomb monocoque, similar to that being used in the aerospace industry. This new car, with its lighter chassis and its improved 427 cubic inch engine, now putting out over 500 horsepower, made its international competition debut in April of 1967. And an auspicious first outing it was. It was Sebring, with Mario Andretti and Bruce McLaren driving the car to victory at an average speed of 102.9 miles per hour. Ford was so impressed with this victory, they quickly readied 4 cars for the 1967 Le Mans 24-hour race. The Mark IV was slated to replace the Mark IIAs of the previous year. The Mark IV boasted unitized construction. The entire monocoque was constructed from aluminum honeycomb material sandwiched between 16 thousandths aluminum sheeting. The two components were then bonded together with epoxy resin and riveted at all the stress points. The Brunswick Corporation was contracted to build 12 of the monocoques, but only 8 cars were fully completed. The front and rear body sections were non-stressed panels. On the Mark IV, the entire front panel was hinged so as to quickly inspect and repair any suspension difficulties. Brakes were now 12 inches in diameter with Kelsey Hayes calipers front and rear. Wheel widths had broadened to 8 inches in front, 12 inches in the rear. The entire cockpit was redesigned, but still retained its airplane-like qualities and efficiencies. The engine remained the 427, but with a new dry deck design and a lightweight cast iron block. Other new features included twin Holley 4-barrel carburetors and a dry sump oil system. The 427 developed 470 foot-pounds of torque at 5,000 RPM and was fed by twin gas tanks holding a total of 41 gallons. The compression ratio of the 500 horsepower motor was 10.75 to 1, and the entire engine weighed 560 pounds. An oil dipstick is clearly visible on the new Ford T-44 4-speed transaxle.
Newly designed ducting gave the Mark IV a clean aerodynamic profile. The Mark IVs were assembled by a special Shelby American team of fabricators headed by Phil Remington. The Mark IVs were the fastest and most reliable cars of their kind ever constructed. Let's revisit Le Mans, France in 1967 and witness the #1 car in action. A total of 11 Fords were entered at Le Mans that year. The Ford team was headquartered in the Peugeot factory near the racing circuit. Andretti and Bianchi were to team in one Mark IV, with Dan Gurney and A.J. Foyt, who was making his Le Mans debut, piloting the #1 car. Ford had 7 cars here under its own sponsorship. Bruce McLaren and Mark Donohue were also paired to drive the event. All of the planning paid off, with Ford's copping 5 of the top 6 qualifying spots, with Bruce McLaren taking top time with a lap time of 3 minutes 24.4 seconds, averaging 147 miles per hour, a full second faster than Bandini's April practice run in a Ferrari 330 P4. The Ford heavyweights consisted of 4 Mark IVs, 3 Mark IIBs, and 2 Mirages driven by John Wyer's British team. As the race gets off to a clean start, Pedro Rodriguez in the NART-sponsored P4 Ferrari leads the field. But Hawkins in the Mark IIB takes the lead at the end of the first lap. There's McLaren in the #2 car getting away. Phil Hill in the stalled Chaparral. The Hawkins-Bucknam Mark IIB led at the 1-hour mark, with the Gurney-Foyt Mark IV in second and the McLaren-Donohue Mark IV in third position. After the second refueling stop, the Gurney-Foyt car took the lead, with Andretti Bianchi in second place. The Mark IVs were approaching 213 miles per hour down the Mulsanne Straight. The Mark IIBs, a refined version of last year's Mark IIA, were topping 206 miles per hour. The Mark IIBs had a shorter and lighter tail section than the previous year's Mark IIA, and weighed in at approximately 2,700 pounds, which, ironically, was about the same weight as the new Mark IVs, even though the latter automobiles were designed for much less weight. The engines used in all the Fords were rated at 500 horsepower,
and were tested at 7,000 RPM. The motors had lasted for 45 hours and 15 minutes during dyno testing, making them very raceworthy. Two of the Mark IVs at Le Mans were prepared by Shelby American, and the other two were handled by Holman and Moody, with the Holman and Moody cars weighing in at a lighter 2,570 pounds. As the day wore on, the Mark IVs were running like clockwork, karting 3-minute 30-second lap times. They held down the first three positions as night approached. The Mark IVs were running about 400 pounds over their design weight, but were also very much improved from a safety standpoint, as they had steel roll cages, an onboard fire system, and an extra 11 pounds per wheel because of an extra safety liner in the tire. Gurney and Foyt displayed obvious joy at their race position as Henry Ford looked on. The night was to hold some surprises for the strong Ford team. 12 hours into the race, Bianchi pulled into the pits in his Mark IV for fuel and a driver change. As Andretti took off with new brake pads, he was reaching the first turn at 150 miles per hour when the car locked up unevenly, sending him into the wall and into a wild spin, ending up in the middle of the racing surface. As he scrambled to exit the car, McCluskey rounded the corner in his Mark IIB, jamming on his brakes to avoid hitting Andretti, and he too hit the wall. As he tried to leave his car, Schlesser, arriving in his Mark IIB, spun into the wreckage. Andretti was hurt. The other two drivers avoided injury. But three competitive Fords were taken out of the competition quickly. With 6 hours left to go, McLaren's yellow Mark IV lost its rear body section down the Mulsanne Straight. He pulled into the pits without the section and was instructed by Shelby to go retrieve it. He did so, drove back into the pits, and the rear section was attached once again, with the use of racer's tape and the belts from the trousers of the car's pit crew. McLaren soon found himself in fourth place as one of the P4s had broken its gearbox. Gurney pitted, and Foyt took over the wheel to finish the race. Toward the end of the competition, AJ was turning 3-minute 40-second laps, competing with one of the P4s. He took the victory at precisely 4 o'clock, having covered 3,249 miles at an average speed of 135.48 miles per hour. Bruce McLaren and Mark Donohue in another Mark IV finished fourth, behind two Ferraris. American drivers in American cars led every lap of the 1967 24 Hours of Le Mans. For 1968, events were to change drastically. Ford decided to withdraw from racing, and international rules called for a 5-liter limit on engine displacement. This marked the active appearance of John Wyer's JW Engineering. They had raced Mirages, modified GT-40s during the 1967 season. For 1968, Wyer decided the Ford Mark I had good potential for 5-liter racing. So the Mark I was redeveloped and refined into the Mark 1B. The brakes were updated and the engine was improved, running now at 4.9 liters, just under the limit, and was capable of producing 400 horsepower. The rear fenders were widened to accommodate the fatter racing tires of the day. The Mark 1B showed a much narrower roofline than the Mark I. Improved ventilation and ducting in the car also helped reduce drag. Working on a very limited budget, the Wyer team set the cars up for the Daytona 24 Hours in 1968. Jackie Eakes qualified his car faster than the record times turned in by the previous year's Mark IV. This, of course, questions all the expense and effort expended in the design of the Mark IV, which may not have been necessary. Porsche 907s were to dominate the Daytona event, finishing 1, 2, 3. At Sebring, a 907 sweep also took place. Eakes and Redmond, along with Hawkins and Hobbs, retired their Wyer Mark 1Bs. The group's racing luck improved at the BOAC 500, with Eakes Redmond finishing first and Hawkins Hobbs fourth. The team was again victorious at Monza, with Hawkins Hobbs taking a clear victory. The 4.9-liter Ford V8 marked the appearance of the Gurney Westlake heads. A new design innovation which helped boost the horsepower to 400 plus. More power, along with new improved body lines, made the Mark 1B more than competitive with its predecessors. This engine was to prove extremely reliable and allowed the Ford cars to continue their Le Mans domination in both 1968 and 1969. This example, number 1076, is a sister to the 1075 car with which Eakes won Le Mans in 1968 and 1969. This car maintains its originality with majesty, having finished third in the 1969 Le Mans competition with Hobbs and Halewood aboard. A good view of the quick-change brake disc, and the tried-and-true GT-40 suspension system. Let's take number 1076 back where she's shown. Le Mans, the year 1968. The JW Automotive Mark 1Bs were at the Sarth circuit without Ford support, but were under the very able command of John Wyer, who had considerable experience in the GT-40 program, having built all of the cars at the fabrication facility in England. The main competition for the three Fords came from Porsche, as Ferrari was not officially entered as a works team. Although the three Gulf cars were very well prepared, the long-tail 908 Porsches held the fastest practice laps and could even pass the Fords on the long 3-mile Mulsanne straight. As the race began, Rolf Stommelin's Porsche jumps into the lead, along with three other Porsches. The soonest Ford got away was in sixth position, the Brian Muir-driven car. The race started cleanly, and by the end of lap number 1, Porsches held the first 4 positions. As the race progressed, the Porsches began to suffer from electrical problems, and the Fords began to close the gap. 8 hours into the race, Rodriguez and Bianchi were leading in the Mark 1B with a Matra V12 very close behind. Brian Muir's Mark 1B found its way into a sand barrier, and he lost much valuable time digging out. After all this hard work, the car was later retired with clutch problems. As Porsche's problems continued throughout the night, the JW Automotive Ford of Rodriguez and Bianchi was 6 laps ahead as dawn approached. The weather was not good during the night, and many cars were left by the wayside during the hours of darkness. With only 2 Porsches left by noon, one 908 and one 907, the German cars picked up the pace. The second place Alfa had dropped out, as had the third place Matra. The Rodriguez-Bianchi car ran flawlessly and took the checkered flag. Ford first, Porsche second and third, Alpha T33s, 4th, 5th, and 6th. These modified GT-40s were to continue their winning ways in 1969 at Le Mans, with Jackie Eakes taking an exciting win away from Hans Hermann in a Porsche 917.